I will not step aside just because of the color of my skin.
The rules are clear. Follow the process.
Rules that strip dignity are not justice.
Justice has nothing to do with this. Only procedure.
The words hung in the air like a gavel striking without mercy. Passengers froze in their seats, every glance caught between fear and outrage, as if the entire cabin had become a silent courtroom. The clash was no longer about a seat or a ticket. It was about whether dignity could survive under the weight of authority. In that stillness, one truth echoed louder than the engines outside. When power hides behind procedure, who will stand to defend justice? If you believe this moment matters, leave one word in the comments. Justice. And make sure to follow so the truth keeps traveling further. The late afternoon light pooled across the polished floor at Terminal 7 in Los Angeles as Danielle Carter stepped through the jet bridge with a worn leather tote folded close to her side. The air smelled of citrus disinfectant and roasted espresso, the kind of airport comfort that made strangers feel like they were all moving in rhythm. She moved with quiet purpose, offering a polite nod to the flight attendant at the door, and slipped into the first-class cabin where the aisle was wide enough to pretend the world was gentle. A paper cup of cold brew from Blue Bottle balanced in her hand. On the way down the aisle, she murmured a soft, "Good afternoon," to no one in particular, the instinct of someone who grew up taught to greet a room and leave people better than she found them. At C2A, she lifted her toe toward the overhead bin and felt the familiar tug in her shoulder, the honest ache of a long day. "Hold on," the voice arrived before the hand did. Allison Price, the purser, slid in front of the seat with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Let me see your boarding pass for this cabin." Danielle turned, still calm, still courteous. Of course. She reached into the tote and offered the printed pass, its edges softened by a day of pockets and polite requests. Allison studied it with the concentration of someone admiring a counterfeit painting. The silence around them was full of watching. A man across the aisle adjusted his reading glasses. A woman in a linen blazer cradled a shopping bag and whispered that first class was not what it used to be. Somewhere behind them, someone set a paper cup in the holder with a hollow clap. "This seat is not available to you," Allison said, the smile tightening. "You need to head back to the main cabin. We have policies. I am assigned to 2A. Danielle kept her voice even. "You are welcome to scan it again." "We do not scan paper twice," Allison replied, and the smile disappeared. With a quick, dismissive motion, she waved Danielle's pass away. The leather tote shifted against Danielle's hip. Just inside the opening, the corner of a hard plastic card caught a glint of cabin light. The briefest wink of an identity never meant to be a secret, and yet held back as if it were a kindness to do so. From row 1B, a young woman with an immaculate blowout lifted her phone. Emily Scott's camera lens gleamed like a watchful eye. "This kind of thing keeps happening," she said into the tiny microphone, voice pitched low as if performing care for an audience. "People trying to sit where they do not belong. I mean, there are rules." "Ma'am," Allison said, the word shaped like a verdict. "Please step away from the seat so we can pre-board legitimate passengers." Danielle set her coffee in the holder by the window and said, "I am not preventing anyone from boarding. I am in my assigned seat." Allison extended her hand, palm up, identification. "The boarding pass you are holding is my identification for the seat," Danielle answered. "If you need to verify anything further, I will be happy to comply at the gate." "Do not instruct me," Allison said softly, and then less softly. "You people always think you can talk your way into places." The words landed with the dull thud of something heavy and familiar. A murmur traveled along the road like a breeze brushing leaves. Danielle steadied her breath. She had learned to let certain words pass through her like wind through tall grass, leaving the roots intact. Emily caught the red mark blooming along Danielle's cheek where Allison's hand had just knocked the boarding pass and the back of Danielle's fingers in one sharp sweep. The pass tore in two, the coffee toppled, and the ribbon of dark liquid ran over the seam of the carpet. Gasps scattered across the cabin. A flight attendant from the galley appeared with a stack of napkins that said, "Thank you" in pale blue letters, and pressed them to the stain as if the right apology could reverse gravity. "Security," Allison called without turning. "We have a situation in first class. Possible fraud." non-compliant passenger. Danielle did not reach for the tote. She did not reach for anything. Her hands stayed visible at her sides, fingers open, the way people learn to hold themselves when the room decides they are a problem. Her eyes moved to the window, where the afternoon sun sliced into the cabin in warm bands. Out on the tarmac, a ground crew member walked with the determined gait of someone earning an honest tip an early night. Danielle imagined the heat of the concrete rising through the soles of his shoes. "Excuse me," said a man in a sport coat, clearing his throat. "I have a connection in Boston I cannot miss. Can we please move this along?" He glanced at his smartwatch, then at Danielle, then away again, as if guilty of catching his own reflection. Allison's smile returned, energized by witnesses. "Sir, we are doing our best to maintain standards." She turned back to Danielle. "Ma'am, leave the tote, step into the galley, and we will get this sorted." Danielle met her eyes without raising her voice. "I will remain in my assigned seat until you verify with the gate. You have torn my pass. I am happy to answer any appropriate questions." Agos, an older woman 2 rows back, leaned toward her husband and whispered that she missed the days when everyone knew how to dress for a flight. The husband nodded and said something about respect. Emily, narrating under her breath, called it a classic case and encouraged her viewers to stay tuned. She described the cold brew on the carpet as though it were a crime scene. A junior flight attendant stepped forward with a wad of napkins, then hesitated, taking in Danielle's quiet posture, the set of her shoulders, the way dignity made space where none had been offered. "Can I get you some seltzer water?" she asked, voice gentle. "Thank you," Danielle said. "I am all right." The intercom clicked, and a recorded voice cheerfully thanked travelers for choosing the airline, reminded them to keep their seat assignments, and mentioned, almost as a joke, that tipping the skycap was appreciated but not required. Laughter fluttered faintly from the rear of the plane, the tired sort that lives on habit rather than humor. Allison bent, gathered the torn halves of the boarding pass, and held them aloft. "This," she said, "is exactly what we see all the time. A fake printed at home? Unbelievable." "It is not unbelievable," Danielle answered, her tone steady as a metronome. "It is very believable, and that is the trouble." Emily's camera tightened its gaze on Danielle's face. In the phone's tiny universe, comments scrolled like ants, eager and thoughtless. Danielle looked past the lens, past the people who had appointed themselves judge and chorus, and settled her eyes on the narrow view beyond the window. A sliver of concrete, a slice of wing, a bright wash of sky. The image steadied her. A sky does not ask who deserves to fly. A young gate agent peered in from the doorway, unsure whether to step across the threshold. Allison flicked her eyes toward the galley, a warning not to interfere. The agent withdrew like a tide. In the aisle, a businessman adjusted his cuff and asked the nearest attendant whether his pre-ordered tea could be brought now, because he had a dinner at a seafood place in Boston and would rather not rush. The attendant promised to check and disappeared, grateful for an easy task. "Ma'am," Allison said once more, "last chance to leave voluntarily. First class is for passengers who understand our standards." Danielle felt the sting along her cheek settle into a warm line. She thought, briefly, of her grandmother's kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, of the way the older women spoke softly when they were angriest, and how every sentence was a kind of prayer for patience. She sat back, folded her hands on her lap, and said, "I understand them very well." "Then you will understand consequences," Allison answered, already signaling toward the front. A hiss of talk swept through the cabin. People leaned closer to one another, their voices humming with that curious blend of outrage and relief that comes when trouble seems to be happening to someone else. A man in the last row of the cabin slid his phone into his pocket and said he hoped the captain would not let this drag on. Flights had schedules, life had rules. In the galley, the junior attendant pressed club soda into a napkin and knelt to coax the stain from the carpet, working small circles as if time, too, might be cleared with patience. Danielle let her gaze drift to the tote again, to the shadowed edge of the card tucked along the seam. She did not reach for it. Some truths are not for proving in a crowd. Some truths wait until the room is ready to hear. Past the curtain, she heard the shuffle of steps and the clipped rhythm of radio chatter. The air felt cooler for a moment as the jet bridge door opened and closed, bringing with it the faint scent of jet fuel and sun-warmed aluminum. Danielle straightened, a reflex older than manners, and folded her shoulders back until the seat recognized her as its rightful shape. The quiet filled the cabin again, not peaceful but expectant, the kind that makes even the hum of the air system sound like breath being held. The intercom crackled. Ground manager is coming to assist. Danielle looked up, a strange resolve flickering in her eyes. Richard Thompson arrived with the unhurried stride of a man who believed time answered to his schedule. He wore a navy blazer that had seen years of carpeted terminals and manager meetings, and he moved past the threshold of the jet bridge into the first-class cabin without looking at anyone in particular, as if the room were an unruly spreadsheet he could sort with a tap. The lingering scent of spilled espresso mixed with the chill of recirculated air. Danielle Carter remained seated in 2A, hands visible on her lap, chin level, the fading warmth along her cheek, a reminder of how quickly dignity can be put on trial. The cabin hummed with that peculiar quiet that forms when people hold their breath while pretending they're not watching. A woman rearranged a silk scarf. A man closed a leather folder without reading it. The aisle, tight as a decision point, funneled attention toward Danielle and the manager bearing down on her. He stopped at the armrest. "Good afternoon," he said, clipped and formal, the greeting more procedure than kindness. "I am the ground manager. We have a boarding process to complete and the departure time to meet. I need to see your boarding pass for this seat and the government identification." Danielle kept her voice even. "My boarding pass was torn. I am assigned to 2A. If you need to verify at the gate, I am ready to cooperate." Allison Price stood at his shoulder, posture sharpened by the presence of authority. She refused to move, she said, and the words came out like a prepared statement. "We have a pattern here. Paper passes that will not scan. A guest insisting on first class without proper documentation." Richard nodded as if a box had been ticked. "Ma'am," he said to Danielle, "please step out to the galley. We will confirm your status and reseat you appropriately. We have paying customers waiting." A few hats tilted, curiosity dressed as impatience. From the first row, the young woman with the perfectly arranged hair, Emily Scott angled her phone to keep faces in frame without becoming obvious about it. She murmured into her tiny microphone, shaping her voice as though she were narrating a civic lesson, and the glow on the screen reflected a rising count of viewers. Her followers were accustomed to quick takes about etiquette and travel tips, but the tone now carried the soft thrill of witnessing a rule being enforced. In the back of the cabin, a gentleman pressed the call button and asked a passing attendant if the departure would still allow him to make dinner near the harbor. He had a reservation and preferred to keep to proper meal times. Danielle exhaled slowly. "I will not step into the galley," she said, "but I will answer any respectful question you ask, and I am willing to verify my seat at the door with a scan." Richard's mouth pressed thin. "This is not a negotiation. It is an attempt at fairness," she answered. Captain Mark Reynolds emerged from the cockpit with the steady gait of someone used to stepping into rooms and ending conversations. His silvered hair and crisp epaulets carry the kind of authority that causes people to sit a little straighter whether or not they have done anything wrong. He took in the scene, the torn paper in Allison's hand, the smear of coffee, the phone's angled just so, Danielle's hands still, her eyes steady. "What is the problem?" he asked, a question designed to reassure his crew as much as to inform himself. "Seat fraud," Allison said. "Non-compliance, interference with crew." "孩子," the captain's jaw said. "We cannot allow interference with safety or schedule," he said. And then to Danielle, "Ma'am, this is not personal. We will have to ask you to relocate while we sort this at the gate. We have procedures. I respect procedures," Danielle said. "I am following them. I am in my assigned seat. You have destroyed my boarding pass. I am asking for verification, not special treatment." A murmur worked through the rows. A gentleman adjusted his tie with the fidget of someone who disapproves, but prefers to seem reasonable. A woman in a tweed jacket tapped a message into her phone and then set it face down, as if the act of nudging the story along had already given her a role to play. Emily narrated softly, suggesting to her audience that patience with rules is what keeps society from unraveling, and that sometimes A firm boundary saves everyone time. Richard lifted his radio. "We will need airport police at the aircraft door," he said, and the words felt like a door closing. Out past the galley curtains, a gate agent glanced in with a question in her eyes, then retreated at Allison's tiny shake of the head. Danielle watched this small choreography of permission and denial and felt the old familiar ache of being weighed from the outside in. She straightened anyway. A person can choose how to hold herself when the room decides it knows who she is. The minutes pressed forward the kind of minutes you feel in your throat. The overhead monitors near the door flashed a reminder about final boarding. A recorded voice announced that the flight would close shortly and thanked everyone for their patience. You could smell the faint metal of jet fuel when the jet bridge door opened and shut, a cool thread weaving through the artificial chill. Passengers shuffled in place and checked watches, a gesture that, when done by enough people, becomes a cloud of pressure carrying its own kind of weather. Officer Brian Davis stepped into the cabin. He was broad-shouldered without seeming heavy, his uniform neat, his gaze steady. He offered the captain a courteous nod that angled himself so he could speak to Danielle without looming. "Good afternoon," he said, and the greeting, unlike the manager's, held a small grain of human concern. "I am Officer Davis. I understand we have a situation about a seating dispute." Richard spoke before anyone else. "We have an unverified passenger occupying a premium seat, refusing to relocate, escalating the situation." Danielle turned her head toward the officer. "My pass was destroyed," she said evenly. "I asked for a scan at the door. I am willing to verify my identification in an appropriate manner. I have not raised my voice or left my assigned seat." Allison lifted the torn halves. "This is what she presented," she said, as though evidence could be weighed by how many eyes watched it. "We see this pattern all the time." Officer Davis accepted the paper with a neutral expression. His eyes moved from the torn edges to Danielle's face, then to the coffee stain, then to the faces arranged in polite expectation. He had worked enough extended shifts to recognize when a story had momentum it did not deserve. Still, his job required him to clear the scene and keep people safe. "Ma'am," he said, careful and calm, "would you be willing to stand in the aisle while we verify? It will just take a moment. If standing changes your perception of me, it will not change the truth," Danielle said. "I would prefer to remain seated where I belong. But I am not refusing identification or verification." The captain folded his arms, the universal signal of a person who believes he has done talking. "We cannot indulge this any longer," he said. "Officer, we have other passengers to consider." Emily's camera dipped and tightened, the lens fixing on Danielle's profile, on the measured rise and fall of her breath. Her voice, pitched just above a whisper, offered context to thousands of strangers. A schedule, a standard, a disruptive passenger. She had not decided whether this would be posted as a cautionary tale or an inspirational one. The comments would decide. Out past the door, a gate agent tapped a tablet and fielded questions from economy passengers craning for a view, that human tendency to make theater of other people's discomfort as a way of measuring their own cooperation. A junior flight attendant returned with a small bottle of still water and asked Danielle if she would like a sip. The gesture landed like a feather on an anvil, a small softness amid hardness that had decided its shape. "Thank you," Danielle said, and set the bottle in the armrest holder without opening it. Richard glanced at his watch, then at the captain, then at the officer. He was not a cruel man, but he believed in the comfort of categories, and nothing in his training had prepared him for how stubborn a person can be when what is at stake is not a seat but a self. "Officer," he said, "we need to move forward." "Ilo." Before he could finish, a voice carried from 2 rows back, older, careful, the kind that prefers courtesy even when it protests. "Excuse me," said a man with a white pocket square folded like a small bridge. "Forgive me for intruding, but would it not be more efficient to scan the manifest at the door? I have seen that done. It is quick." Allison smiled without smiling. "Sir, we appreciate the suggestion. We are following standard procedure." He nodded, chastened by civility. "Of course," he said, and laced his fingers together. Officer Davis took in the exchange like a chess player scanning the board for moves that would preserve as many pieces as possible. He lowered his voice further. "Ma'am," he said to Danielle, I would prefer not to escalate. If we step just a few feet forward, we can verify and possibly seat you right back. Yes. Danielle looked at him, and her gaze held questions she would not ask out loud because she had asked them enough in her life. Why the benefit of the doubt had to be earned only by some. Why a seat could be both a place and a test. Why a person could become a symbol without volunteering. She also saw in him a decent attempt to be fair inside a machine that did not make fairness easy. Officer, she said, I hear your tone, and I appreciate it. I will remain here. I am not disrupting. I am waiting for verification. The captain's patience thinned to a line. I am not permitting this aircraft to become a debate hall, he said. Officer, remove her to the gate. We will not depart until this is resolved. The hush that followed was not silence so much as a collective holding of position. Passengers, many of whom had not spoken a word, fed the moment with leaning bodies and angled glances. Phones hovered. In the galley, the junior attendant wrung out a napkin and pressed it again to the carpet, as if persistence could undo a moment that had already chosen its direction. Emily narrated that law enforcement had arrived and that a resolution was imminent. She layered her voice with practiced empathy, a sound that could be edited later to match whatever moral the audience demanded. She also, without realizing it, began to wonder about the woman in 2A and the patient sitting like a straight back in a narrow seat. The intercom bleeped, and a cheerful recorded voice reminded everyone to keep aisles clear and thank them for choosing the airline, as if gratitude could sponge out a stain. Through the open door, the edge of the jet bridge glowed in afternoon light, that exact brightness you see just before day tips toward evening. A gate agent returned, whispered something toward the galley, and was waved away. People shifted. The room, if a cabin can be called a room, felt smaller. Officer Davis squared his shoulders. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture. He simply slid one hand toward the leather case on his belt, and the gesture, even done gently, changed the air. The captain nodded once. Richard took a half step back, the better to give the officer room while also retreating from the front line of responsibility. Allison clasped the torn paper like a flag, proving a point she did not intend to relinquish. The junior attendant stood very still, eyes flicking between the hands that would decide what happened next. Danielle lifted her chin. Her hands remained open and visible, the posture of someone who knows that in certain rooms, safety begins with being easy to read. The cabin's hush gathered itself into a single, fragile second. Officer Davis set his hand near the cuffs. Ma'am, please comply and step off the plane. Danielle's gaze turned resolute. Officer Brian Davis paused, the weight of the moment resting in the angle of his hand near the cuffs, when Danielle's voice crossed the air as evenly as a measured line. Before you do that, she said, please look at something I'm going to show you. The calm in her tone did not challenge. It invited sanity to re-enter the room. The aisle seemed to widen by a breath. The captain's folded arms loosened by a fraction. The ground manager shifted his stance, as if some small recalculation had begun without his permission. In row 1B, the bright eye of Emily Scott's phone steadied, the lens catching a soft gleam from the toad at Danielle's feet. The cabin light found the hard edge of a card inside, the same quiet glint that had winked days and miles ago wherever Danielle chose not to lead with what she carried. He did not move the cuffs closer. Ma'am, the officer said, keeping his voice low, slowly, and keep your hands visible. Danielle nodded once. She lifted the worn leather tote to her lap with the respect you give a notebook. The zipper slid open with a small sigh. She reached in and withdrew a flat, weathered portfolio. The kind executives still use because it holds not only paper but also a sense of ceremony. Her hands never disappeared from sight. She placed the portfolio on the tray table and opened it like a door. The first thing she revealed was an identification card set in clear plastic. The laminate caught the overhead light and gave it back, without flourish. Her photograph in crisp profile, her name in letters that did not need to be large to carry authority, her title printed in a font that corporations choose when they want seriousness to feel unarguable. Danielle Carter, Chief Executive Officer. The logo below the title was unmistakable to anyone who had looked at a boarding pass, a tail fin, a billboard along a highway at sunrise. The cabin drew a long, involuntary breath, like a single lung realizing it had been holding air too long. Allison Price took half a step forward, then stopped. As if the carpet had become a thin lake she was not prepared to cross. Anyone can print a badge, she said, but the sentence refused to finish itself with confidence. Danielle did not respond to the comment. She placed the badge on the tray where everyone could see it. Officer Davis, the captain, the manager, the phones angled from neighboring rows. From a second sleeve inside the portfolio, she produced a formal letter on heavy paper that had a faint decal along the edge. The letterhead carried the same logo in restrained ink, the kind that looks expensive without trying. The language was legal and careful, and intimate with consequence. The board of directors appointed, effective on a stated date written out in full words, a chief executive officer named Danielle Carter to serve at the pleasure of the board, to oversee operations, to bear ultimate responsibility for culture and compliance. There were signatures in deep blue ink, the sort of strokes a person makes when the world has taught him that his name will be examined more than it will be read. She turned the page so the captain could see the seals. He took the document with the guarded care a pilot reserves for checklists and weather maps. His fingertip traced a watermark, something subtle in his face unknodded. Not in relief, so much as in recognition that the ground beneath the moment had shifted. Richard Thompson, the ground manager, found himself searching for a foothold in etiquette because training had not shown him what to do when the person you had categorized opened the folder that recategorized the room. "We can verify this with corporate," he said, but his voice had already abandoned the certainty that had carried it into the cabin. "You will," Danielle said, "and you will also verify this." From another sleeve, she removed a shareholder certificate, the kind printed on thick stock with an old-fashioned border that speaks a quiet language of ownership. It documented a significant personal stake held by Danielle Carter, shares spelled out in words rather than numerals, the kind of number that turns up in quarterly reports and in the weight of boardroom silence. Officer Davis did what good officers do when confronted with new facts. He let them be facts. He did not pretend to have expected them. He did not pretend they were not there. His hand moved away from the cuffs. "All right," he said, almost to himself, as if accepting an internal update. "All right." The cabin's hum changed color. It was not admiration. It was the sound a crowd makes when a narrative tilts. In row 1B, Emily's camera did not blink, but something in Emily did. She had shown her viewers the neat geometry of rules for a long time. Now she felt the rule that matters most. Assume less, notice more. Danielle turned one more page, and what lay beneath was not a card or a certificate, but a file compiled over months by people who had been instructed to look past the comfortable explanations. The tab bore a label by hand, not because the printer was broken, but because someone had wanted to feel each letter arrive. Internal Investigative Report. The pages inside were time-stamped and date-stamped, each date written out in full words, each time recorded in words that turned minutes into sentences. There were instant logs, passenger statements, photographs from galley cameras where such cameras were permitted by policy, redacted where privacy demanded mercy. The report did not raise its voice. It documented. She did not dramatize the contents. She summarized with the simplicity of arithmetic. "Over the past 18 months, she said, we have tracked repeated reports of unequal treatment by this crew. Passengers of color questioned about ticket validity at a rate far above their peers. Passengers asked for additional identification without clear cause. Passengers threatened with removal for behavior that, when presented by other passengers, resulted in a reminder rather than a punishment." Allison found her voice and tried to cut through the low thrum in the cabin. "We enforce the same standards for everyone." Danielle did not argue. She turned a page. On a flight dated the day 20 of the month of March, a father traveling with 2 children in premium seating was told to move to the rear because the children were described as disruptive, though a family seated in row 3, documented as louder in multiple passenger statements, remained. On a flight dated the day 11 of the month of May, a woman wearing a headscarf was denied a beverage service that others received, with the explanation that service had ended though the cart was still being pulled down the aisle. The captain's gaze lowered, not to avoid hers, but because the words refused to let his eyes stay where they had been, Richard swallowed the regret of someone who sees how easily a good intention can be weaponized by a habit. In the jump seat near the galley, the junior flight attendant stared at the report with a kind of aching relief. She had kept mental count for months. She had not known who would ever choose to write it down. Emily's viewers, many thousands by now, watched lines of text glide beneath Danielle's fingers. Not because the camera could read them, but because the camera, like everyone else, understood the difference between a claim and a record. Comments that earlier sharpened into judgments now unfurled into questions. The shape of the crowd's heart shifted in the way crowds sometimes do when someone refuses to match rage with rage. "Officer," Danielle said, and her voice wore respect the way her suit wore quiet. "You asked for compliance. I am showing you something so we can comply with a deeper truth than one person's accusation in one cabin. I am not accusing from a distance. I am traveling in plain sight to see what travelers see." He nodded, and in that nod sat a career's worth of moments when being decent meant allowing yourself to be changed by what you had not expected to learn. "I appreciate that," he said. "I also appreciate that this seems bigger than a seat dispute." The captain cleared his throat, a sound that carried more than a request for quiet. "We need to notify corporate," he said. And for the first time that afternoon, his voice held not command but obligation. Danielle set the portfolio between them and pressed a single button on her phone. She placed it on speaker and waited through a ring that sounded like it belonged in a room with paintings older than most airports. A voice answered, warm with the kind of formality people keep ready for pages in their calendars, marked in thick ink. "This is Charles Whitman." "Rather, Charles," Danielle said, still seated in 2A, her hands where anyone could see them. "We are at Los Angeles, preparing for departure to Boston. There is a situation aboard that you should confirm publicly." "Understood," he replied, without asking why she had not started with smaller channels. "May I speak to the crew and the officer present?" "You may," Danielle said, and she turned the phone slightly so the small speaker could carry the boardroom to the aisle. The captain introduced himself by full name, the officer by his. The ground manager gave his name in a tone that had changed color since he entered the plane. Allison stepped forward into the sound as if into a light, and for the first time since the first word of the first exchange that afternoon, she did not appear ready to win. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitman said, "please accept this confirmation. You are speaking with your Chief Executive Officer, Danielle Carter. She serves at the pleasure of the board, and she has the full confidence of this company in matters of safety, dignity, and culture. She is not an imposter. She is not a publicity exercise. She is the person in charge, observing outcomes we intend to improve." The room did not applaud. It adjusted. The idea that order had been upheld by pushing one woman from one seat to any other became a smaller idea all at once. The officer let out a breath he had not filed as stress until it left him. The captain, who had worn responsibility like a coat for longer than many passengers had been alive, felt the odd, unfamiliar comfort of not being the most responsible person in the room. Allison's posture tried to hold, then softened half an inch. "I was enforcing policy," she said, as if the word policy could still perform the magic it had performed for her so many times before. Danielle's eyes met hers. "Enforcement without listening is not policy," she said. "It is theater. Do you know?" Richard, to his credit, gave a small, raw nod. The kind a person gives when he notices he has been facing the wrong way down a hallway and turns himself around in public. The portfolio had more pages. Danielle did not need to show them all to show enough. This report proposes required training, an independent channel for passenger equity concerns, a review of how we verify documents without humiliation, and real accountability tied to reduction of incidents. Not a pamphlet, not a memo. Real accountability. Whitman's voice returned over the speaker. "Proceed," he said, and the single word did not belong to the flight schedule. It belonged to the next thing a culture does when it remembers what it promised to be. Officer Davis looked at Allison, at Richard, at the captain, then back at Danielle. "Ma'am," he said, "for my part, I apologize for the way this approached an outcome it did not deserve. I will document that you were cooperative. I will also document that this crew escalated without adequate verification. You are doing your job, Daniel said. So am I. A passenger 2 rows behind Danielle, the older gentleman who had gently proposed a simple scan earlier, cleared his throat. It was the same voice, but what it carried now was not suggestion. It was witness. I would like to say, for the record, he said, that I did not speak up soon enough. I am sorry. The words did something no policy can guarantee. They allowed other people to find their own better selves. The woman with the tweed jacket murmured yes. The man with the leather folder said he was wrong to think speed mattered more than respect. Emily's voice, when it came, sounded different in her own ears. To everyone watching, she said softly, I am going to keep recording. I am also going to say that rushing to conclusions is easy. Seeing a person is harder. I am choosing harder. I saw the captain handed back the appointment letter as if returning a passport at a border that should never have been there. Miss Carter, he said, letting the title do the work of apology that words sometimes fumble. How would you like to proceed? We will complete the verification you should have started with, she said. You will document the incident accurately, and we will depart when the cabin is ready, not when the crowd is satisfied. She slid the badge and the certificate back into their sleeves. The motion was not triumphant. It was tidy, the way you put a tool away when the job at hand has changed. The intercom chimed and announced in its sunny voice that final preparations were underway. The irony did not miss the room. Still, the words felt less like an instruction and more like an invitation to do the next thing right. Behind the curtain, the junior attendant quickly rechecked belts and bins with a focus that belonged to the kind of service people remember for years. At the door, the gate agent stepped in and asked, softly, if a manifest scan would help. It did. It took moments. It confirmed what the report, the phone call, and the portfolio had already made clear. When the scan flashed its approval on the tablet, a small wave of human relief lapped the aisle. Danielle did not smile. She allowed her shoulders to rest by the width of a thought. Officer Davis repositioned himself out of the way, the physical vocabulary of a man returning power to its proper seat. The captain nodded toward the cockpit, then paused and looked at Allison and Richard. They had run out of familiar lines. Perhaps that was good. Emily lowered the phone a fraction, just long enough to look with her eyes instead of her screen. She would post the footage later, but she understood that the internet would not get the last word unless people chose to give it. Some stories do not end with a share. They begin with an apology and continue with a policy that holds. The late light from the jet bridge slid across Danielle's hands as she closed the portfolio. The leather made a soft sound, like a page turning, like a chapter closing, so the book can keep going. Her gaze swept the cabin, not to savor victory, but to set the next expectation. She had shown who she was, but more important, she had shown what the airline would have to become to deserve the people who trusted it to carry them. Officer Davis adjusted his radio and said into it, in words that would become a small footnote in the longer report, that the situation had been resolved without removal, that verification had been completed, that the passenger in 2A would remain in 2A. He did not add that respect had returned to the room like air returns to a lung. He did not have to. You could hear it in the way people began to move normally again, in the way hands left armrests and returned to magazines and cups, in the way a cabin remembers how to be a community of strangers who will share a sky for a few hours. The junior attendant, cheeks still flushed with the effort of cleaning a stain that had done more damage than a spill should, set a fresh napkin by Danielle's cup holder, and, without a word, replaced the toppled drink with still water in a new plastic cup. Danielle thanked her. The attendant nodded, a small promise sealed in exchange that does not need to be spoken to be binding. At the doorway, Richard's radio crackled with a corporate frequency he had memorized long ago. Only now it sounded like something other than a shield. He raised it to his mouth, waited for a break, and said, with a humility that made him feel taller rather than smaller, that he would need to file an incident report and request guidance on next steps from legal and human resources. He did not realize he had already taken the first step by saying we instead of they. The captain glanced at the clock on the bulkhead, where the time displayed in words because someone, somewhere, had decided long ago that numbers rush and words breathe. It was a few minutes past 4 o'clock. He was thinking of the checklist he would need to revisit, the taxi order, the pushback window. He was also thinking of the crews he had trained and the habits they had built. He would talk to them differently now. That realization did not threaten him. It relieved him. In row 1B, Emily lifted her phone again and, for the first time that day, turned the camera toward herself. She spoke softly, so the microphone would not distort the edges of her words. She said she would keep filming, but that she had something else to offer besides footage. She offered what a good witness offers, attention that does not demand the villain to feel useful. Danielle closed the folder. Now, we talk about responsibility and change. The chime for final boarding sounded. The hush that followed did not feel empty. It felt like a room ready to hear. Danielle rested the leather portfolio on the tray and lifted the first section with the patience of someone paging through a family album that holds difficult truths. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She simply read the facts aloud, and the facts carried their own gravity. She began with dates written in words, times written in words, routes written in full, and then the pattern that lived beneath them. Over the past 18 months, reports of unequal treatment had arrived from flights crewed by the same names, the same rhythms, the same reflexes. She described passengers questioned about ticket validity at a rate that was different depending on the color of the passenger, requests for extra identification without cause, tones of voice that changed shape based on a glance. She did not accuse, she accounted. Allison stood very still, and because stillness can feel like certainty when it is rehearsed, she tried to lean on it. Earlier, she had said she had done this job for 20 years and could spot a scammer. The words returned now, like a step you forgot was broken. They did not hold. Danielle turned the page and described a spring flight where a father and two children in premium seating were told to move to the back while a louder family remained. She described a flight where a woman in a headscarf was told beverage service had ended while the cart rolled on, unable to end for those to whom it never seems to end. She described how a reminder is offered to one passenger while a warning is offered to another for the same breath and the same gesture. The junior flight attendant listened with her hands folded, as if keeping them still might keep her face from admitting what she knew. The captain's gaze lowered to the report, the way a pilot looks at a weather map that shows a storm he would rather not see but must plan for. Richard, the ground manager, did a careful thing. He let his jaw soften. Even a small release can let understanding in. Danielle named the tools the company would build, not as punishment first, but as prevention with teeth. Mandatory training that is real and repeated, an independent channel for passenger equity concerns, protocols that verify documents without humiliating the person holding them, accountability tied to outcomes and not to slogans. She told them that numbers must be written out like promises and not hidden behind digits that hurry past the eye. She told them that minutes must be counted in words when the person is being sized up, because time stretches when dignity is on trial. In row 3, an older woman leaned toward the aisle, her voice gentle but clear. She said there had been a winter flight where her daughter had been asked twice to show identification after already clearing the gate. She remembered the humiliation more than the cold. Hearing the entry summarized in the report felt like a hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. In row 2, a man lifted his chin and admitted he had been present on the spring flight with the father and the children. He had said nothing then. He said something now, that the family in row 3 had been louder, and the crew had chosen not to notice. Emily's camera did not blink, but Emily did. Her narration slipped from certainty into curiosity, the most honest sound she had made all afternoon. She told her viewers she was watching a record being read, not a claim being argued. She said that maybe the lesson for a day like this was to stop treating a seat as a test and start treating it as a place, because a place is where people are, and tests are what we give when we have not learned to listen. Out by the open door, the light brightened and then softened, the way late afternoon does when it begins to consider becoming evening. The jet bridge breathed cool air and the faintest trace of jet fuel into the aisle, mixing with the scent of coffee that had turned from spill to stain to lesson. A few passengers whispered about missing happy hour by the harbor. Others thumbed their rideshare apps, pushing pickup times back by a quarter hour. No one moved for the door. People were learning in place. Danielle paused and closed the first section of the report, not because she had run out of pages, but because the room had absorbed enough for the next step. She lifted her phone and placed the call on speaker. The ring sounded like it belonged in a room lined with portraits and old wood, and then Charles Whitman answered with the measured warmth of a person who understands what his voice does when it fills a space. He had spoken earlier to confirm who Danielle was. Now he would do something different. He asked to address the cabin and the officer and the crew on the record. The captain gave his name again, the officer repeated his, and Allison and Richard spoke theirs in voices that had lost their armor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitman said, and the phrase sounded less like a ceremony and more like a responsibility. "You are hearing the work we pledged to do. It did not begin today, and it will not end tonight. You have a chief executive in that seat because she insists on seeing what you see, hearing what you hear, and measuring what you measure. She has my full authority to institute the reforms she just named, beginning now. She also has my full support in holding anyone accountable for practices that harm dignity or safety. This is not a press release. This is policy, and you are witnesses." The cabin did not applaud. It recalibrated. The officer's hand, which had already drifted away from the cuffs, settled at his side with a kind of quiet relief. The captain shifted from the stance of a man enforcing schedule to the posture of a leader making room for change. Richard nodded once, not to Danielle, not to Whitman, but to the idea that decency requires admitting when you were wrong in public and then doing work in private that looks like repair. Allison finally spoke. Without the scaffolding of certainty, her voice revealed its human weight. She said she had enforced standards as she understood them. She said she had believed that firmness kept the cabin safe. She said she had said those words about 20 years and spotting scammers because she trusted her experience more than she trusted any stranger's story. She did not try to defend the moments described in the report. She did not try to excuse. She said she would attend the training and that she would listen. It was not everything, but it was a door. Danielle did not perform grace, and she did not perform triumph. She acknowledged what had been said, and then she set the next expectation. She said the company would measure progress aloud. She said the reports would not be allowed to gather dust. She said that when an incident occurred, the response would be immediate, and the language would be words in full, not code or numbers that make harm look small. She asked the officer to document the reversal that had happened in this aisle. She asked the manager to file the incident honestly. She asked the captain to join her later in a brief call with flight operations about verification at the door that preserves dignity. The requests were not rhetorical. They were assignments. Emily told her viewers she had expected a spectacle and had found a syllabus. She said she would post a video. She also said she would post a list of resources for people who wanted to learn how bias works and what to do when they see it. She asked anyone who had been unkind in the comments to try again with a different kind of courage. She left the camera pointed at Danielle's hands as they turned a final page of the report and then closed it, tidy and complete. The older gentleman who had suggested a simple scan earlier cleared his throat, the sound of manners returning. He said he had spent a lifetime believing that order requires sternness. He said he was beginning to understand that order also requires mercy, and that mercy is not the same as leniency. Mercy demands attention to the truth. He thanked Danielle for inviting truth into the room with a voice that did not shout. A gate agent stepped in with a tablet and asked, softly, if a manifest check would help. It did. It took a few breaths, the kind you count when you are trying to calm yourself. And then the screen confirmed what the portfolio and the call and the common sense in the room had already made clear. 2A belonged to the woman seated in it. The agent apologized for the delay to anyone within earshot, then slipped away to close the door when told. Danielle lifted her eyes and took in the faces arranged like a small temporary town. The crew who would need to unlearn and relearn. The officer who had chosen to be changed by new information. The passengers who had almost let impatience vote louder than conscience. The witness with the camera who had decided curiosity was stronger than certainty. She did not ask for applause or acceptance. She asked for better habits. The captain thanked Whitman, promised a follow-up, and returned to the cockpit with the particular care of a man who knows that the most important part of flying is not the taking off, but the landing. Officer Davis stepped back to his post with the gentle competence of someone who prefers resolutions that do not require force. Richard lifted his radio and requested guidance for immediate documentation and notification to training, to legal, to human resources. He said the words slowly, as if carving them into his own expectations. The junior attendant, who had been working at the stain in small circles, set down the last napkin and pressed her palm once against the carpet. When she looked up, her expression carried a promise she did not yet have words for. She would greet the next passenger the way she had just handed Danielle a fresh cup of water, with respect first, not after. Danielle turned toward Emily's lens. She did not crowd it. She did not ask for the last word. She spoke as if talking to a neighbor across a small fence, a neighbor she expected to see again. This is not just about me. This is about all of us. Phones vibrated on armrests like small moths trying to be heard over the air system, and the cabin shifted from a fragile quiet into the practical energy of a crisis that now had a shape. News producers left voicemails that pronounced their call letters carefully. Email subject lines stacked on Danielle's screen like a skyline, and texts from communication staff arrived with the steady cadence of a metronome set to urgency. She did not start by answering them. She looked at the people in front of her, the crew who had run out of familiar scripts, the passengers who would tell this story at dinner tables for years, the officer who had given space to facts when they arrived, and she spoke in a tone meant for rooms where steadiness must be modeled. She said that dignity could not be restored with apologies alone. It would require structure, and structure starts with clear terms. She explained, in words and not in digits, the weight of delay and dispute when a company lives in public. Lawsuits are not just headlines, they are years. Settlements are not just numbers, they are signals about what a culture tolerates. Market value does not fall in a vacuum, it falls when trust does. She named the costs in ordinary language, the way you would explain a budget to a neighbor who pays attention, and then she did the quieter arithmetic of consequence. She said there were two pathways available to the crew who had escalated without listening. The first involved immediate suspension without pay, mandatory training that would not be a slideshow but a series of sessions with civil rights educators, formal apologies printed and posted where the harm had been visible, evaluations tied to measurable change. The second involved termination for cause, loss of eligibility to work in the industry, and personal exposure to liability if later findings showed willful misconduct. Allison swallowed in a way that made the muscles at her temple move. She asked, in a voice that contained none of the show it had carried earlier, if the training would be punishment disguised as education. Danielle answered that training would be education with accountability, which is to say it would be work. Richard lifted his radio and asked to notify the necessary departments now because momentum matters in a crisis, and also because he understood that waiting is one way cultures avoid changing. Captain Reynolds looked at the cockpit door, then back at Danielle, then at the officer, measuring not the distance to departure, but the distance to repair. In row 1B, Emily let her audience see her face for a full breath before she turned the camera back to the scene. She told them the number of people watching had climbed to a figure measured in many tens of thousands. But she did not say the figure out loud. She did not want the spectacle to swallow the substance. She described what was happening as a choice being offered in public, and she invited her viewers to notice how people behave when the room becomes a mirror. In row 3, the older gentleman folded his hands, nodded at nothing in particular, and whispered to his wife that consequences without cruelty can still feel like justice. Officer Davis stood with the attention of someone whose presence is meant to prevent harm, not define it. He waited without hurrying the moment. The junior attendant held a stack of clean napkins and watched the edges of the room, ready to step forward if anyone needed water, or a blanket, or a word. The air felt less thin, not because the plane had moved, but because the story inside it had. The intercom chimed. A recorded voice thanked everyone for their patience and explained that departure would occur after final cabin checks. Danielle nodded to the captain. He nodded back, the small exchange between two professionals agreeing to do things in the right order. Then Danielle returned to the matter at hand. She said that option 1 would not be a reprieve from shame, It will be a year of assignments designed to replace reflex with understanding. She described sessions meeting with community advocates, listening to passengers who had been turned into problems by uniforms and policies, and then writing reflections to be evaluated by an independent panel. She said that under option 1, pay would stop now and resume only after completion of the first courses, because learning at this scale is not a side project. Allison's breathing steadied. She looked at Richard as if seeking a bridge. He looked at Danielle as if seeking permission to be human. The captain asked formally for a moment to confer with his crew. Danielle said yes. The three of them bent their heads in a small circle as the cabin watched without trying to look like it was watching. Their hands did not touch. Their voices did not rise. When they straightened, the captain spoke for them with the humility of a person who has learned that authority held too tightly breaks. He said they would accept option 1. He said the words simply, as if the sentences wanted to be used to build. A current moved through the cabin, the way wind moves through a field and leaves behind a pattern you can only see from a distance. Emily narrated it as a turning. She told her audience she had seen apologies before, some shaped like statements and some shaped like press releases. This sounded like an agreement to be different tomorrow, and that, she said, was the only kind of apology she wanted to record. Danielle formalized it. She stated the terms again so there would be no confusion later. She named the offices that would receive reports by the end of the day written out in full words so that no detail would get lost in translation. She assigned the manager to initiate documentation now, the captain to schedule a call with operations after landing, and the purser to notify human resources and training as soon as the aircraft door closed. She turned to Officer Davis and asked him to note in his report that the passenger had remained cooperative, that verification had been completed, and that escalation had occurred without adequate basis. He said he would. Phones chimed like tiny bells as push alerts found the people who had asked to be notified about everything. In the terminal, televisions did what televisions do. They rolled a headline into a loop and parsed it into questions for panels. On Danielle's screen, emails from civil rights organizations arrived with offers of support and requests for partnership, and a measured note from the legal department sat like a paperweight on all the upcoming hours. She answered one message only. A brief update to the communications team that said, in plain language, that the room had chosen work over spectacle. The captain asked the junior attendant to make a short announcement. She spoke with a careful kindness and said that departure would follow shortly, that beverages will be offered after takeoff, and that the crew thanked passengers for their patience. She did not repeat any language about policy. She did not need to. The older woman who had described a winter humiliation asked if she could say one thing. Danielle said yes. The woman stood, steadying herself with a hand on the seat back, and said that when she had been younger, she had believed that change came when someone raised a voice loud enough. Now she was learning that change also comes when people use their positions to make different choices with the same calm tone. She thanked Danielle for choosing. In row 1B, Emily's comment feed flooded with apologies from viewers who had typed sharp judgments in the first minutes of the stream. She read a few aloud. She said she was going to leave the early comments visible as a record of what quick certainty looks like. And then she would pin the resources Danielle had recommended for learning how to intervene when bias shows up in public. She promised her audience she would follow this story beyond the virality of today. Richard's radio crackled with a call from communications at headquarters, who had learned to ask for facts 3 times before asking for quotes. He gave them what he had heard and emphasized that the incident report would reflect the steps taken to change course mid-air, metaphorically if not literally. He found himself saying thank you when the voice on the other end told him they appreciated accuracy, and he wondered when the last time had been that he thanked someone for asking him to be precise. Officer Davis spoke softly to Danielle and asked whether she needed anything further from him before he returned to his post. She said she needed one thing only, his written statement that patience had prevented an unnecessary removal. He nodded. He had already decided to write that sentence. The captain checked with the cockpit. Procedures waited like rails do, ready to carry what had been set right. The jet bridge door would close soon. The safety briefing would begin. People would become a community of strangers for a few hours and then disperse into their evenings. into seafood dinners and harbor walks and calls to loved ones to say they had landed. But before any of that, Danielle looked once more at Allison, at Richard, and at the junior attendant whose hands had done the gentle work that tells the truth quietly. She told them she expected to hear, in the coming days, how they were offering dignity first. She told them she would be checking. It did not feel like a threat. It felt like keeping a promise. Emily's glance drifted over the cabin and settled for a moment on the window, where the afternoon light had begun to soften toward the color that predicts evening. She told her viewers that she had started the stream to capture a disruption and was ending this segment to follow a repair. She reminded them that repair is not content, it is effort. She said she would be back with updates after the flight, and that she would try, for once, to make the internet useful. The intercom chimed once more. Final preparations were announced in words that had never sounded so literal. The gate agent stepped in to confirm, in a voice just above a whisper, that the manifest had been checked and the door could close. Danielle's phone, which had been patient, lit up with a new notification that stepped past the flood of media and into the lane where policy becomes government. A message appeared on Danielle's phone screen. Secretary of Transportation wants to speak now. And discerned S. Morning light lifted across Fort Worth like a patient curtain as Danielle stepped into her office on the 47th floor. The skyline held steady beyond the window, low and sun-warmed, with highways already humming toward Dallas and the broad runways stretching like silver ribbons to the horizon. On the credenza lay a bound quarterly report, its cover as plain as a courthouse door. She poured coffee into a white mug, the kind you keep because it fits your hand, and opened the report to the executive summary. The words did not rush. They arrived with the quiet confidence of a ledger that's been kept with care. Discrimination complaints down by 78% across domestic and international operations. Passenger satisfaction among communities of color up by 45%. Training completion at more than 99%. Average resolution time for complaints reduced by more than half. The numbers were written out in words, just as she had insisted, so that no one could glide past them. She read the footnotes first. They told the life of the numbers. Case reviewers added to the new passenger equity office, counselors retained for crew who needed help, unlearning habits, third-party auditors sitting in quietly on flights and taking notes without being noticed. She turned another page. Photos showed gate agents gathered around tablets during early morning stand-ups, trainers in conference rooms with flip charts, cabin crews practicing how to ask for verification without performing suspicion. The report listed the airports where the changes had taken deepest root: Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Dallas, Miami, Boston. It listed the places that needed more attention too, and did not disguise their names. Her assistant tapped on the door and stepped in with a thin stack of envelopes. Some were from customers, some were from advocacy groups. One, thick and cream-colored, came from a couple she recognized as the older passengers in row 3 that afternoon in Los Angeles. The wife's script tilted right in gentle loops. She thanked Danielle for reading the report into a room of strangers and said that in the weeks afterward, she had watched 3 separate crews treat passengers with what she called simple grace. She described a moment in the boarding line when a gate agent held out a scanner with an open hand and said, "Let's verify," in the same voice she had used a moment earlier to compliment a child's backpack. She said it made all the difference. Danielle kept that letter on the desk while she worked through the others. A community organizer in Detroit wrote that the airline's new scholarship program for ground staff had already paid for 2 part-time degrees. A civil rights leader wrote that oversight meetings were frank and worthwhile, and the minutes looked like action rather than theater. A small business owner wrote that her employees felt safer traveling to conferences. Not all the letters were warm. One questioned whether cameras on uniforms were surveillance rather than accountability. Danielle scribbled a note to revisit retention policies for footage and to publish clearer rules about privacy. The point was not to be perfect. The point was to stay honest. At mid-morning, she walked the operations floor, where the wall monitors scrolled flights and weather in a soft glow. She stopped at a cluster of desks where the new equity team sat, headphones on, voices low, posture engaged. They logged incidents in sentences rather than codes. so that the human shape of each call would not be lost. A supervisor pulled off her headset to brief Danielle. Reports were trending down not because people were afraid to file them, but because fewer things were happening that needed reporting. Random audits of cabin interactions suggested the training was sticking. People are starting with respect, the supervisor said. They are not hiding behind policy. It slows them down by seconds and saves them hours. At lunch, she walked across the plaza to the small diner where crews grabbed turkey sandwiches and coffee before briefings. The bell on the door rang with the soft, particular charm of a place that has been feeding workers for years. She held the door for a ramp worker balancing 2 to-go cups and a paper bag that smelled like grilled onions. The counter server greeted Danielle by name, the way Texans do when they have decided you belong to the town, and pointed to the corner booth that was free. She took her seat, thanked the server, and watched the ebb and flow of uniforms. There was laughter at one table where a purser told a story about a child who had convinced an entire cabin to play a game during turbulence by counting out loud in a calm voice. At another, a gate agent walked a new hire through the scripts for sensitive conversations. You cannot unsay a word, the agent said. Choose ones you will not regret. In the early afternoon, she sat with the legal team and the head of training to review the Memorandum of Understanding with national advocacy organizations. The document was spare and firm. It codified the role of an external committee with access to complaints, the timeline for reviews, the authority to recommend corrective action, the guarantee that bonuses would be tied to reductions in complaints among minority passengers and to improvements in satisfaction scores. The training had showed her the next round curriculum. It included role plays, recorded with consent, and debriefs, led by facilitators trained in conflict resolution. It included a unit on apology that did not reduce apology to a script. It asked people to admit harm in words and to repair harm in deeds. Her afternoon moved in the dependable cadence of leadership. A planning call with the communications team about sharing progress without self-congratulation. A review of the passenger rights app's latest update, which now allowed travelers to submit audio notes rather than just text, because not everyone thinks in paragraphs when they're upset. A budget session where she insisted that the diversity fund remain at $50 million a year despite suggestions to cut because numbers were moving in the right direction. The fund would grow or hold, it would not shrink. In between, she dialed the Secretary of Transportation and spoke about the draft regulation that other airlines would soon need to meet. He sounded like a man who had learned that good policy begins as culture and ends as law. He thanked her for staying at the table. Before the sun tipped toward evening, her assistant returned with a calendar reminder about the NAACP Gala in Dallas. She would attend, but she would not give a speech. She had learned that some rooms do not need another microphone as much as they need another listener. She also had a note to join a webinar with the National Union of Flight Attendants to hear concerns about the camera policy. She believed in the cameras, but she believed even more in treating people like adults when you asked them to wear one. News screens in the lobby near the elevators carried stories with captions that sounded less like headlines and more like progress reports. One called "The Changes, the Henderson Protocols," a name she did not love but would accept if it helped ideas travel. Another ran a segment where a professor explained how organizational habits can be rewired with repetition and real stakes. A third aired a short piece about a young gate agent who had caught a small telling moment and moved it toward kindness. She had said "good afternoon" to a passenger and then, without prompting, added, "I am glad you are here." It was nothing and it was everything. Back upstairs, a message awaited her from Allison Price. It arrived without ceremony and did not expect an answer. Allison wrote that she had completed 40 training sessions and had volunteered to speak at 3 more. She said she had learned to hear the difference between firmness and defensiveness. She said she had apologized a lot, and she was learning that apologies do not empty a person. They make room. She closed by saying she had greeted the family in premium seating that morning with the same tone she used when a frequent flyer asked for a glass of water, and that it had felt right. Minutes later, a message arrived from Emily. The subject line read, "Update." The body of the email told Danielle that the live stream audience she had once chased for attention now follow her for conversations about equity, and that she had partnered with community groups to produce short clips on how to step in when bias shows up at a counter or in an aisle. She said she still filmed, but she filmed differently. And when she edited, she listened for humility. She asked if Danielle would join a panel with a teacher, a store manager, and a bus driver, because the story did not belong to airplanes alone. As the hour leaned toward late afternoon, Danielle toured the call center, where passenger feedback arrived in the uncomplicated truth of people's voices. A woman on the line described the quiet kindness from a crew member who had noticed her hesitation and offered help without making it a scene. A man described a boarding process that felt like common courtesy, not compliance. A supervisor pulled up a dashboard showing trend lines sloping in the direction you hope to see when you are trying to prove that human beings can improve at being human. Danielle asked for the outliers, not only to celebrate what worked, but to understand where it failed. 2 incidents had been flagged the previous week in smaller stations. She took notes, asked for follow-ups, and left with the same promise she had made on the plane, to check back. Near dusk, she returned to her office. The quarter's achievements did not glow. They rested. That is how progress looks when it is real. She stood at the window and watched the runways catch the day's last light. Somewhere out there, a plane lifted, wheels gathering into the belly like a thought tucked away for later. She thought of the crowd in that cabin months earlier. The officer who had chosen to be changed by new information. The captain who had shifted from enforcement to leadership. The manager who had learned to say we when talking about responsibility. The junior attendant who had replaced theater with service. The passengers who had found their voices. The witness who had turned spectacle into syllabus. She thought of the older couple and their letter. She thought of the child with a backpack who would get on a plane someday and be greeted with simple gladness. The phone on her desk lit up with a call from Charles Whitman. He asked for a brief update before the board committee meeting and said he wanted to hear about the parts that were not going well yet. She told him about the small stations with uneven results, the concerns about cameras, the need to recruit more trainers from outside aviation, people who could bring different stories into the rooms where crews gathered to learn. He thanked her, and then he did not hurry off the line. He said that for the first time in years, he felt the company's promises were aligned with its daily habits. He said that alignment is culture, and culture is what people do when nobody's watching. They hung up with the easy economy of colleagues who trust the next step to be taken. The building settled into evening. In the hallway, someone laughed softly. In the plaza below, a bus stopped and sighed and pulled away. Danielle sat again at the desk and opened a fresh document on her laptop. The cursor blinked like a calm heartbeat. She began to write her weekly note to employees, the one that had become a small ritual, a steady conversation in a company that now talked to itself more honestly. She wrote about a gate agent in Phoenix who had slowed down her greeting just enough to say a name correctly, and how dignity often begins with a syllable offered with care. She wrote about a mechanic who had spotted a safety issue and had been thanked publicly, because culture changes when you reward the behaviors you say you want. She wrote about the passenger rights app, the thousands of submissions it had received, and the way people were using it to praise, not only to complain. She wrote about the 2 outliers, and she named them because sunlight does not humiliate, it heals. Before she signed off, she thought of how to end. A note cannot carry the weight of a policy, but it can carry a habit. The habit she wanted to encourage was not outrage, not vigilance for its own sake, not performance. It was attention. Attention to the greeting at the counter, the tone in the request, the assumption tested before it turns to speech. She read the last paragraph aloud once in the quiet room, the way a radio host would read a final line to make sure it cleared the throat and landed in the ear. Then she set her hands on the keys and typed the sentence she wanted the whole company to practice until it felt like muscle memory, until it traveled out of airports and into kitchens and classrooms and sidewalks. She opened the laptop and wrote, "Change does not come only from a CEO. It begins with every glance, every word, every action." And in the quiet that followed the storm, what lingered was not the clash of voices, but the way a room full of strangers learned to see one another more clearly. The reports, the policies, the public reckonings were important, yet the true measure was found in the softened greetings at a counter. In the way, an apology opens space for trust to return. The lesson is simple, but never small. Love and accountability, when carried in steady hands, can turn even our most painful missteps into ground for repair. Just as a porch light guides us home through a long night, a single act of kindness can shift the course of a journey for all who walk beside us. Take a moment to notice those quiet lights in your own days, and if this story has touched you, consider passing that warmth forward to someone still waiting for it.